Okay, a little bit of an update now. So first things first, at the beginning of this job, I had talked about wanting to replace the bearings for the main shaft in the gearbox and replacing them with sealed units so that I can make the gearbox hopefully oil tight, because I want to start using only gear oil. I'm tired of pissing around with grease and having grease and oil and trying to mix it and having it leak out all over the floor. So when I went and looked up the bearings that I was going to need, I went to the manual that I had, and that's the Pete Snidel manual, and it said that the large bearing for the main shaft in the gearbox on the drive side is a 6305. That is incorrect. Once I got it all apart and I actually removed the bearing, it turns out that this bearing, and I don't know if you can quite see it, and probably not. No, it's coming in there to focus, as a 6206. I had gone out and bought a 6305, had the same outer dimensions and had the same thickness, but the inner race was smaller diameter. So clearly it wasn't going to work. The shaft wasn't going to pass through. So no problem. I ended up, I just went out and got another one, and I mean, they're not super expensive. You know, it's roughly around $20 Canadian. So I got a second one. So that was one thing I just wanted to clear up. I wanted to get get it out there, because in my first when I first started this, I'd said 6305 was the bearing. That's incorrect. It is 6206. So, having said that, then I proceeded to deal with the inner case cover for the transmission, for the gearbox. And if you recall, what I found was this small bearing on the Kickstart side, which goes through here, the Kickstart side, the cage for the balls, the ball bearings, had completely disintegrated. There was just a few tiny chunks here and there inside the box, and a couple on the side of the shaft, but the rest of it had actually been ground into a fine metal powder, and it was throughout the oil that I drained, and it was throughout the gearbox, and it was basically throughout everything. I ended up having to flush out every nook and cranny in every part that I took out of this gearbox, and then get as much out as I could. Then I blew everything out with compressed air, and I think I've got most of it out now. It was just a bloody mess. So that was completely ground up. Here's what was left of that small bearing. Just there was not one bit of the cage left. Tiny chunks, and not even very many of them. Most of it was just ground up. Now, the amazing thing about it is that when I looked at the gear set is fine. There was no scoring, there was no dings, there was no chips out of it. Everything was good. I just had to clean everything up, and it looked like it was all good. I checked the bushings in both the end of the kickstart, where the shaft goes on one side, and then the bushing on the drive side for the bottom there, the lay shaft, and it's all fine. So it didn't seem to do any damage, but I'm just lucky that that bearing didn't lock up. Now I've got two case covers here. So what happened was, this is the one that was originally on the bike, and you know, it's one of those aha moments. So the outer race was stuck in here. Of course, the inner race, everything, the balls in the inner race just fell apart because there was nothing holding them in. And when I was messing around with this, I managed to break off a chunk on the outside. Now I'm going to fix this up and keep this as a spare part. I'm going to straighten this up a bit and just use some JB Weld and epoxy this back in place. This is not anything that sees pressure, and it doesn't have to hold a liquid level on this side, so I should be able to get away. It won't be pretty, but meanwhile what I did was I managed to source another cover, and this one's fine, and this one came with a bearing installed. So the small bearing, and the same thing as this one is a 6303. So this one the fellow that I bought it from, he said he was an American, so he said he only had a few thousand miles on his bike, but it doesn't matter. I wanted to replace it anyway with a sealed unit, and that's exactly what I did. So when I was looking at this and trying to decide what to do to get this out, because there's really no way to push it out from this side on the outside of the race, which is what I wanted to do. I'd have to apply force to the inner race, and I didn't want to do that because I was worried about doing the same thing, kind of breaking the balls, breaking the cage that the balls ride in. And I came up with something, I don't know, I had one of those aha moments, and I remembered from my courses back in college, back in process, when I many years ago, about the different coefficients of linear expansion of different metals. So the case being an aluminum alloy and the bearing being made out of steel, I looked it up, and steel is roughly half the linear coefficient of linear expansion as aluminum, which means for the same amount of temperature applied, aluminum will expand twice as much as steel will. So what I did was I took this out into my barbecue, and I sparked up the barbecue and I fired it up. I got up to about 170 degrees, and I just put it on the grill, and I put it this way so that the open side was facing down. And I left it there for maybe 10 minutes. I went back, I lifted this up, and the bearing was just sitting there on the grill. It had fallen out. I didn't have to push it out. I didn't have to do anything, because my plan was to bring it back into the garage and have to push it out with a socket and a drift or whatever, but there was no need. So the aha moment was also like a dough moment, because when it came to the original cover, I had the outer race here, and I had used my Dremel tool with some diamond bits, and I chewed through the steel till I got to the bottom and basically just made a groove, and then I was able to turn it over and just kind of go around the outside edge of the race and just drive it out from this side. But if it had occurred, I wish it had occurred to me before I went through all that trouble to do that, to do the same thing, because if I'd just taken this to the barbecue, turned it upside down, set it at 170 degrees or so, 180 degrees, the thing would have fallen out. So it was like, oh man, I went through a whole lot of work for no reason. So if you ever need to get the bearing out of these things, that's the way to go. Just find a hot oven or stove, barbecue. In my case, I wasn't going to do it in my kitchen stove. The barbecue was the obvious solution, because there was a bit of oil in this, and I ended up having to clean the barbecue grill. The last thing I want to talk about is when I was taking this off, I was trying to find a socket or a wrench to fit on this nut. It's the first time I've taken this apart. The diagram that I have for the parts diagram was not very clear as to what this was and what this was for. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, is this holding something together? And I looked and looked, and you can see it's a different color, but it's the same thing, right? It's a six-sided nut on this side. But when you look at it, when you go on to the other side, what it is it's the stop here it holds the stop in place for the Kickstart pawl. So the Kickstart pawl comes out and hits against that. And it's just punched over on this side. There is no screw through, like it screws in, but then they just punch over the other side here. So there was no need to take it out, no need to mess with it. So if you're taking one of these apart, ignore that. Just don't even worry about that. That's got nothing to do with it. What else? So I'm at the stage now where I've just going to push out the old main bearing seal on the gearbox case, and I'm going to install my new sealed bearing. Right now that's in the freezer. So my plan is to take my heat gun and just apply a whole bunch of heat to the outside metal of the gearbox and heat it up. And then I'll be able to squeeze in. I'm just going to put through the other side there. I may actually use the main shaft, because it's what I use to punch it out from this side. So I may use it to just gently push it in. If it doesn't want to push in gently, then I'll do up something with a bolt and just kind of slowly squeeze it together from both sides here, maybe with the sprocket on this side. But anyway, so I got to take out, this is the old seal, and I want to have a close look at that, because I was getting oil leaking out. That's part of the problem, was they have an open bearing and just this one seal here, and it's just useless, right? So I'm thinking this thing was kind of worn, And even though there's a spacer there, it still can turn, right? And might have been worn out. So anyway, I just want to have a look at that. But I've got a new one to replace it with, so I'm going to replace that. And then lastly, while I was cleaning out the inside gear of the gearbox, this selector stop here that is spring-loaded, you can see it just goes in and out. This thing flew out, luckily into the gearbox, and the spring was inside, and I was trying to figure out why the heck that happened. So what had happened is you'll see there's a groove on the side of this, and it's just supposed, the metal on the edge of this is just supposed to be punched over a little bit into that groove so it keeps it from flying out. Well, this thing here had almost no punch at all, and as soon as I moved the selector a certain way, poof, this thing just flew out. So I took it out and I put it in my vise and squeezed it, and then I was able to just use, I have a very small punch, and I just peened it over just a little bit to hold it in place, and now it's holding in place. I did mark it before I took it out. It ended up being 3 turns, so because I want to get it back in the same spot, because this really determines how the bike shifts, a great deal for how the bike shifts. So I want to make sure I get it as close to as it was before as possible. Anyway, so I'll take the I got to get the old gasket material off the face of the gearbox first, and I'll do that first. Then I'll put that guy back in. But anyway, yeah, I just wanted to give a quick update, and I definitely wanted to talk about this not being an issue. Don't worry about that when you're taking it apart, and what the correct number for the bearing is. Both of these bearings, the one that failed, this one here from the drive side, as well as this one that was in the new case that I got. These are all Indian bearings. They're all from India. I was stunned to see that this one had failed as badly as it did. And I was just lucky that the thing didn't lock up on me. I'm familiar with a buddy of mine who had a Norton who had the bearing on his lay shaft go, and it actually locked up on him. And luckily didn't pitch him off the bike, but you know, he was running along on the highway, and the rear wheel, everything just locked right up. So he got lucky. So I'm glad, and so was I, that that didn't happen with this one. I was kind of pissed off. So this should work better. Oh, and the other thing too, I've read so many different comments on different sites about, and certainly the one that I'm on, about whether or not to take off this inner seal and just leave this open so that the oil inside the gearbox splashes onto the bearings. But you know, I'm not going to. Both these bearings are going to go in, and I'm going to leave them sealed. I realize these are packed with grease, but I mean, I'm looking at this. I don't trust that the lubrication certainly is going to get up this high, or even properly lubricate these bearings. Certainly, considering the failure that I had on that one. So at least I know these things are lubricated. They'll stay sealed. If you consider that the bearings on the wheels for the motorcycle are also sealed units, and you'll run tens of thousands of kilometers and not give it a second thought, why would I worry about these things being sealed and not being splashed on from the grease inside the gearbox? And in addition to that, any little impurities or bits of grit or pieces of flaking metal or anything that are in the oil that are circulating around, I don't think they're going to affect the gears. But if they start getting into the bearings, and this is open, and start getting in here, it may very well damage the bearings and may accelerate some erosion on the bearings. So they're going to stay sealed for now. It's going to keep oil from leaking out, and it's also going to keep oil from contaminating these bearings. It's going to stay the way it is. So the project continues.